Let me read to you a passage from the 9th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 9 to 13. It's the Gospel for Friday of the 13th week in Ordinary Time. St. Matthew writes, "As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. 'Follow me,' he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?' On hearing this, Jesus said, 'It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners.'" That's from Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 to 13. Let us consider Matthew. The notable point in this gospel passage is Christ's invitation to Matthew to follow him, and Matthew's immediate response. He immediately rose from his work desk and followed him. The significance of this might be seen by considering the call of others. Matthew narrates Christ's invitation to the principal apostles, Peter, Andrew, James and John, at the beginning of his account of the public ministry. We read that Christ called Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, to follow him, and immediately they left their nets and followed him. Then he saw James and John mending their nets, and he invited them in similar manner, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 to 22. It indicates their deep love for Jesus Christ and a complete detachment from their work, career, possessions, and existing prospects. The Gospel of St. John shows us in chapter 1, verse 35 to 42, that as a matter of fact, at least Simon and Andrew, and presumably John, and therefore probably James, had already met our Lord and come to know him in Judea. Andrew and John were disciples of John the Baptist, and at their meeting with Jesus, in effect, they became his disciples then. It is their formal call later, when back in Galilee, that Matthew records. The point, though, is that their immediate response to Jesus Christ in Judea, according to John, and then in Galilee, according to Matthew, indicates their first-rate moral and spiritual quality. It is not unlike the immediate response of Paul when Jesus revealed himself to him on the road to Damascus. In the Gospel of Matthew, following the call of the four principal apostles, Christ launches his public ministry, and then his long Sermon on the Mount is given. With that, the public ministry is resumed. A little later, Christ, we read, going along from there, saw a man sitting at the tax table, Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, just as he had walked by the Sea of Galilee when he called Simon and Andrew. He said to Matthew, "Follow me." When he called Simon and Andrew, he promised to make them fishers of men. All he said to Matthew was, "Follow me." Matthew's response was exactly the same as theirs. He got up and followed him. It indicates that Matthew was in no sense just a grubby tax collector of the kind widely perceived. He was a great soul, and Christ knew it. Not only was Matthew detached from his possessions and career, not only was he possessed of a deep love and reverence for Jesus Christ, but he was very humble. He makes a point of telling the reader that he was, yes, a tax collector. It was when he was at this reviled work that he was called. His companions were sinners and tax collectors, for after he was called and entered the company of Jesus, he sat with Jesus at table with many tax collectors and sinners, as they were regarded especially by the Pharisees. Matthew chapter 9, verse 10 to 11. When Matthew writes of the commissioning of the 12 disciples and Christ's bestowing on them authority to exorcise and to heal, he gives us their names. The only one whose profession is mentioned is himself, Matthew the tax collector, chapter 10 verse 3. He regards himself in lowly fashion. There is nothing, he obviously thinks, for him to boast about. He was a despised tax collector, and Jesus Christ called him. I cannot but wonder whether the inspiration for Christ's parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector was Matthew himself. This parable is not given by Matthew, but by Luke, chapter 18, verse 9. The publican in the parable prays over and over again his magnificent prayer, which Cardinal Newman once described as the essence of authentic religion. O God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I like to think that this was the prayer of Matthew's humble soul before and after his call by Christ. Matthew would have been guilty of his sins. We know nothing concretely of that, but we can see that he was very humble and abandoned all when Christ's privileged call to him came. Matthew went on to pen his gospel, which many, taking their cue from Augustine and from the common testimony of early references to Matthew's gospel, consider the first of the four. In it, he strove to show that Jesus is the promised Messiah, fulfilling beyond all expectations the inspired prophecies before him. Apart from his apostolic labours during his lifetime, till the end of the world, Matthew's inspired gospel will bring the person of Jesus Christ to countless souls yearning as he did for God and his grace. Our gospel passage today shows Jesus Christ walking along, stopping in front of an obscure government official who attracted little more than silent dismissal, and calling him to the most wondrous life. He was called to be one of the 12, an intimate companion of God made man. In a special way, the call of Matthew can be considered as symbolic of the universal call to holiness directed to all, no matter how obscure. Matthew's immediate response shows the depth of goodness that can be found in the most unregarded hearts. God had been preparing him for this moment, and he rose to the occasion. God can do great things for me, yes, and for each of us.